Hello and welcome to an episode that will discuss industrial policy in India with special reference to new industrial policy of 1991. I'm Dr. Sabah Ismail. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Economics, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. In today's episode, we will discuss the various features of the new industrial policy and work out its implication for the industrial development of the country. The industrial sector of India, with its future opportunities and high employment potential, embraces the path to economic development of the country. India has attained a realistically sufficient level of self-sufficiency in manufacturing a wide range of basic and capital goods. Progress in the manufacturing sector has the perspective to the standard of living of the general public of India. The country is well on its way to become the foremost manufacturing location for companies around the world. In this scenario, it becomes important to understand India's industrial policy and see the changes that it went through after its enforcement. Keeping this in view, we will discuss the following in today's episode. First of all, we will try to understand the meaning of industrial policy. Then we will examine the historical background of India's industrial policy in pre-independence era. We will also discuss the various industrial policy resolutions after independence. We will try to list causes which were responsible for formulation of the new industrial policy. We will also discuss the objectives of the new industrial policy and examine its various features. We will also see the changes which were incorporated in this policy later on. At the end, we will trace the limitations, if any, of the new industrial policy. This will be followed by an assessment of the policy in terms of its likely contributions to the solutions of the serious problems that India faces. Let's first understand the meaning of industrial policy. Industrial policy indicates the respective roles of the public, private, joint and cooperative sectors. It underlines the national priorities and the economic development strategy of the country. It also spells the government policy towards industries, their establishment, functioning, growth and management. Now that we understood the meaning of industrial policy, let's begin with pre-independence era. The history of organized industry in India can be traced since 1854, when the real beginning of the cotton mill industry was made in Bombay. The foundations of jute industry were laid near Calcutta in 1855. Coal mining also progressed about this time. They were the only major industries which had developed substantially before the First World War. During and after World War I and II, more liberal policies were adopted by the authorities, such as the discriminating protection policy, which gave momentum to industrial development. Several industries developed and a number of new industries came up, but their production was neither adequate nor diversified in character. During that period, there was some emphasis on planned industrial development in terms of Bombay Plan. Bombay Plan is the name commonly given to World War II era set of proposals which were given for the development of post-independence economy of India. This plan was published in 1944-1945 by 8 leading Indian industrialists. The key principle of Bombay Plan was that the economy could not grow without government intervention and regulation. At the time of independence, India was industrially a backward country. British rulers discriminated against Indian companies and promoted their own vested interest in India. After independence, the national consensus was in favor of rapid industrialization of the economy, which was seen not only as the key to economic development but also to economic sovereignty. In the subsequent years, India's industrial policy evolved through successive industrial policy resolutions and industrial policy statements. The first industrial policy resolution was announced in 1948. At that time, the Constitution of India had not taken its final shape, nor was the Planning Commission constituted. Moreover, the necessary legal framework was also not put in place. This resolution emphasized the importance of securing a continuous increase in production and ensuring its equitable distribution. Industrial Policy Resolution of 1948 divided industries into 4 categories. First, defense and strategic industries. These industries were reserved for government, for example, weapons, atomic energy, railways, etc. Second, basic and key industries. In this category, the existing private industries could continue, but no new private entrant is permitted. Only government was allowed to set up new ventures. But the government reserved the right to nationalize private industries in the national interest, for example, telecommunications, coal, iron and steel, aircraft, shipbuilding, etc. Third, private industry. These were the industries for which license will be given. Fourth, residual. This category was not clearly defined but comprised of industries which were not included in the other categories. Under the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1948, the first 5-year plan was implemented and also a number of important developments took place in India. For example, the enforcement of Constitution of India, the acceptance of socialist pattern of the society as the objective of social and economic policy by the Parliament. All these developments necessitated the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956. The Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956 was based on the Mahalanobis model of growth, which suggested that emphasis on heavy industries would lead the economy towards a long-term high-growth path. This was the first comprehensive statement on the strategy of the industrial development in India. The second 5-year plan was implemented under the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956. This resolution widened the scope of the public sector. It also classified industries into 3 schedules. Schedule A. It was comprised of 17 industries exclusively under the domain of government. These included railways, air transport, arms and ammunition, iron and steel, atomic energy, etc. Schedule B. It comprised of 12 industries representing mixed sector, which would be progressively state-owned, but private sector was expected to supplement the efforts of the state. Schedule C. It contained all the remaining industries and it was expected that private sector would initiate development of these industries, but they would remain open for the state as well. Along with dominance of public sector, as discussed, the policy resolution was having a number of entry and growth restrictions on the private sector, especially on large firms and foreign establishments. License was mandatory for establishing new units with investments above a specified limit or for manufacturing of new products or for undertaking substantial expansion. There were restrictions on foreign capital in Indian industries as well. Despite the demarcation of industries into separate categories and other restrictions, the resolution was flexible enough to allow the required adjustments and modifications in the national interest. Another objective spelled out in the Industrial Policy Resolution 1956 was the removal of regional disparities. This could be achieved through development of regions with low industrial base. Accordingly, adequate infrastructure for industrial development of such regions was duly emphasized. Given the potential to provide large-scale employment, the resolution reiterated the government's determination to provide all sorts of assistance to small and cottage industries for wider dispersal of the industrial base and more equitable distribution of income. The resolution, in fact, reflected the prevalent value system of India in the early 1950s, which was centered on self-sufficiency in industrial production. The Industrial Policy Resolution 1956 was a landmark policy statement and it formed the basis of subsequent policy announcements. There were subsequent announcements made which were by and large in the nature of minor changes in one or the other part or parts of the 1956 policy. These announcements were made largely to meet the new challenges faced in the subsequent years. These policy statements were made in 1973, 1977, 1980, 1985 and 1986. Together, these statements did amount to some significant modification of the 1956 policy, but in its essentials, the 1956 policy remained intact for all these years. The industrial policy of India prior to liberalization in 1991 was characterized by the features like dominance of public sector, entry and growth restrictions, restrictions on foreign capital and technology, etc. In this backdrop, let us now discuss the new industrial policy making a sharp departure from the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956. The Government of India announced the new industrial policy on 24th July 1991. Before we actually go into its detail, let us first understand the causes which were responsible for its formulation. The most important reason for the formulation of the new industrial policy was the economic crisis of 1991. The economic crisis of 1991 was primarily due to the large and growing fiscal imbalances over the period of 1980s. Large fiscal deficits over time had a spillover effect on the trade deficit, culminating in an external payment crisis. The gross fiscal deficit of government, including center and state, rose from 9% to 12.7% of GDP over the decade from 1981 to 1991. For the center alone, the gross fiscal deficit rose from 6.1% to 8.4% of GDP in the said decade. Since these deficits have to be met by the borrowings, the internal debt of the government accumulated rapidly, rising from 35% to 53% of GDP over the decade from 1981 to 1991. The foreign exchange reserves had dried up to the point that India could barely finance 3 weeks' worth of imports. The most important visible sign of the country's economic crisis in early 1991 was, first, extremely low foreign exchange reserves of rupees 2400 crore, which was just enough to buy from abroad only 3 weeks' requirements. Second, high fiscal deficit of 8.4% of GDP. Third, the rate of inflation was as high as 13.5%. Fourth, internal debt of the government was as high as 53% of GDP. In this scenario, government recognized the need for India to grow as a part of world economy and not in isolation. Therefore, the Government of India announced the new industrial policy, which was popularly known as LPG, which stands for Liberalization, Privatization and Globalization. This policy marked a paradigm shift and totally transformed India economically as well as socially. Let us now look at the objectives of the new industrial policy. First, to consolidate the strength built up during the last 4 decades of economic planning and to build on the gains already achieved. Second, to correct the distortions or weaknesses that may have crept in the industrial structure as it has developed over last 4 decades. Third, to maintain a sustained growth in the productivity and gainful employment. And fourth, to attain global competitiveness. In pursuit of these objectives, government have decided to take a serious initiatives in respect of the policies related to the following areas: industrial licensing policy, foreign investment, foreign technology agreements, public sector, MRTP Act. MRTP stands for Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices. Let's begin with the first feature of the new industrial policy, that is regarding industrial licensing policy. In the new industrial policy 1991, new industrial licensing policy was introduced to ease restrictions on capacity creation in industrial sector and to respond to emerging domestic and global opportunities by improving productivity. For the purpose, the government abolished industrial licensing for all projects except for 18 industries which were related to security and strategic concerns, social reasons, hazardous chemicals and overriding environmental reasons, and items of elitist consumption. However, currently only 5 industries are under compulsory licensing on account of environmental safety and strategic considerations. They are distillation and brewing of alcoholic drinks, cigars and cigarettes made from tobacco and manufactured tobacco substitutes, electronic, aerospace and defense equipment of all types, industrial explosives and hazardous chemicals. Only 3 industries where security and strategic concerns predominates will be reserved for the public sector. These are atomic energy, the substances notified by the Department of Atomic Energy, and railway transport. The government also liberalized the industrial location policy. There is no requirement of obtaining industrial approval from the government for establishing industry at locations which does not fall within the radius of 25 kilometers of cities having population of more than 1 million. Later on, government has relaxed even the location-specific conditions in setting up of industries. Entrepreneurs are now allowed to independently choose the position of establishing an industry. However, land use guidelines as well as environment legislation still regulate industrial locations. Industries of non-polluting nature such as electronics, computer software and printing can be located within 25 kilometers of the periphery of cities with more than 1 million populations. Other industries are permitted only if they are located in designated industrial areas. The exemption from licensing is applicable to all substantial expansion of existing plants. The second feature of the new industrial policy was regarding foreign investment. Since 1991, promotion of foreign direct investment has been an integral part of India's economic policy. Foreign investment was expected to bring advantages of technology transfer, marketing expertise, introduction of modern managerial techniques, and new possibilities for promotion of exports. To achieve this, Foreign Investment and Promotion Board has been constituted to negotiate with a number of large international firms and approve direct foreign investment in selected areas. To provide access to international markets, foreign equity holding up to 51% equity will be allowed for trading companies primarily engaged in export activities. Since 1992-93, the Indian stock market is open for investment by foreign institutional investors, often called as FIIs, and Indian companies satisfying certain conditions may access foreign capital market. Another change was the reform of the foreign exchange rate policy. The rupee has been made fully convertible on the current account. The effort is to move towards capital account convertibility. The third feature of the new industrial policy was regarding foreign technology agreements. Automatic permission will be given for foreign technology agreements in high priority industries up to a lump sum payment of rupees 1 crore, 5% royalty for domestic sales and 8% for exports, subject to total payment of 8% of sales over a 10-year period from date of agreement or 7 years from commencement of production. In respect of industries other than those included earlier, automatic permission will be given, subject to the same guidelines as discussed earlier, if no free foreign exchange is required for any payments. No permission will be necessary for hiring of foreign technicians and foreign testing of indigenously developed technologies. Payment may be made from blanket permits or free foreign exchange according to RBI guidelines. The fourth feature of the new industrial policy was regarding public sector. It was proposed that portfolio of public sector investments will be reviewed with a view to focus the public sector on strategic, high-tech and essential infrastructure, whereas some reservation for the public sector is being retained. There would be no bar for areas of exclusivity to be opened up to the private sector selectively. Similarly, the public sector will also be allowed to enter in areas not reserved for it. Public enterprises which are chronically sick will be referred to the Board of Industrial and Financial Reconstruction, BIFR. A social security mechanism will be created to protect the interests of workers likely to be affected by such rehabilitation packages. In order to raise resources and encourage wider public participation, a part of the government's shareholding in the public sector would be offered to mutual funds, financial institutions, general public and workers. Boards of public sector companies would be made more professional and given greater powers. There will be a greater thirst on performance improvement through greater autonomy, and management will be held accountable. The fifth feature of the new industrial policy was regarding MRTP restrictions. The MRTP Act has been amended to remove the threshold limits of assets in respect of MRTP companies and dominant undertakings. Provisions related to the requirement of prior approval of central government for establishment of new undertakings, expansion of undertakings, merger, amalgamation and takeover and appointment of directors under certain circumstances have been removed. Emphasis has been placed on controlling and regulating monopolistic, restrictive and unfair trade practices. MRTP Commission has been established and authorized to initiate investigation suo motu or on complaints received from individual consumers or classes of consumers in this regard. Before coming to the limitations of the new economic policy, let me discuss briefly the Northeast Industrial Policy enforced in December 1997. In an effort to mitigate regional imbalances, the government announced a new Northeast Industrial Policy in December 1997 for promoting industrialization in the northeastern region. This policy is applicable for the states of Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, Manipur, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland and Tripura. The policy has provided various concessions to the industrial units in the northeastern region. Example, development of industrial infrastructure, subsidies under various schemes, excise and income tax exemption for a period of 10 years, etc. Northeastern Development Finance Corporation Limited has been designated as the nodal disbursing agency under the scheme. Let me now trace the shortcomings of the new industrial policy. While the new industrial policy has much to promote growth and efficiency, it has paid little attention to a number of serious problems. As such, the industrial scene continues to be marked by some highly unsatisfactory features like overlooking of employment. One important aspect of the economy which has been neglected in the new industrial policy is that generation of employment to match with the increase in the labor force. The new industrial policy seems to turn its focus away from this problem and displays the same fetish for growth alone as has been the case during the 80s. Another essential element of the success of the new industrial policy is that the freedom of enterprise should percolate at every level of administration. The new industrial policy embodies intentions and actions of the central government alone. These, no doubt, are important, but there are a number of things which need to be done at the state level and below it. For example, suppose an industrialist wants to set up a production unit, may not require license from the central government, but he will have to acquire land, get building plans sanctioned, seek electricity and water connections, etc. For all these, he has to approach administration at the state or district or city or village level. The rules and procedures at these levels can delay the projects and thereby nullify the objectives of the new industrial policy. Another shortcoming is that the new industrial policy seems to confine to the liberalization of the environment for dynamic industrial development. This, no doubt, is important, but no less important is the role of research and development in making industries innovative in respect of the resource use, processes and products and their marketing. The provisions relating to the small sector do not amount to any coherent and definite picture for this sector. Hence, the future of these industries is not clear. I would like to conclude this lecture with the assessment of the policy in terms of its contributions to the solutions of the serious problems that India faces. First, the new industrial policy is credited with achieving the huge increase in India's trend rate of growth of GDP from the so-called Hindu rate of growth of 3 to 3.5% during 1950 to 1980 to nearly 6 to 7% per annum over the last 2 decades. Second, delicensing of most industries has helped entrepreneurs to quickly seize business opportunities. Third, removal of control under the MRTP Act has facilitated expansion and growth. Fourth, inflow of foreign capital and technology transfer has increased at alarming rate. Lastly, it is worth mentioning here that although successes are many, but the miserably poor millions have not benefited. Somehow, economic power and wealth have been concentrating in a few hands and the masses have, by and large, been left unbenefited. Before we end this episode, let's have a quick recap. In today's episode, we tried to understand the meaning of industrial policy. We have examined the historical background of India's industrial policy in pre-independence era and explained the various industrial policy resolutions after independence. We also tried to understand the causes which were responsible for formulation of the new industrial policy. We discussed the objectives of the new industrial policy and examined its various features. We have also discussed the limitations of the new industrial policy and examined the policy in terms of its importance and contributions to the solution of the serious problems that India faces. That's all we have for today. Thank you and have a nice day.